Hi there, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement show. I'm the host, Philip Eidson, and I'm joined on the virtual couch this week by two returning guests and friends of the pod. It's Greg Tennyson, the CPO of VSP, and Stephany Lapierre, the CEO and founder of Supplier intelligence platform tealbook. And you might recall, earlier in the summer, I actually mentioned that I'd facilitated a number of roundtables around the US on the topic of supplier intelligence. We actually titled those roundtables, Exploring the Upside of Accessible Intelligence. And Steph accompanied me at all of them. Greg chaired our session in San Francisco. So what I thought I would do today is invite them both on the show to share some of the key insights that they walked away with based on the collective input of, I think it was around 60 different procurement executives. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and let's roll the tape.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
So hi everybody, and thanks for joining me today. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm joined actually by two guests. I'm joined by Stephany Lapierre, the CEO of tealbook, and Greg Tennyson, the CPO of VSP. Lots of acronyms in there. So Steph, Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I know that you're both returnees, so thankful that you weren't scared off too much by your first experiences of the art of procurement. So for some context, Steph, I know you and I, a couple of months ago, we traveled around a number of different US cities hosting, facilitating a number of roundtables related to the topic of supplier intelligence. And in our San Francisco session, actually, Greg, you were very gracious in chairing that session. So in the discussion today, I thought what we could do is kind of share and discuss some of the findings from the roundtables. Before we do, I just wanted to ask a question that I think follows up on certainly, Steph, when you were part of the procurement revolution, you shared a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey, and I think we touched on it the last time you were on the show. And that's kind of small business and innovation within procurement. You know, I'm really passionate that as a function, you know, we have to become an innovation broker. You know, we bring innovations to our company from the outside. But a lot of small and young businesses, you know, they might be that hotbed of innovation, but they can often struggle to get a look in when it comes to large enterprise procurement groups. So I just wondered, I know this is kind of a long question, could you share some thoughts perhaps based on your experience of what any procurement leaders listening could actually do to help support or encourage small businesses?
You know, I think one of my favorite quotes actually from Joe Gres at J&J, who said, "You're so lucky to be in procurement because you have a window into the world." Mm-hmm. And it's true. You have the opportunity and the duty to your company to be looking for companies who will add the most value to your business. And, you know, sometimes it may mean to leverage incumbent suppliers, and other times it means looking for new options and stay on top of what's happening within the industry. The toughest thing is to sell into procurement.
Right.
Because if you can sell into procurement, you can basically sell to anybody. And as an entrepreneur building a business selling to procurement, you know, I know firsthand the challenges. Yeah. And mostly because there's a bit of a pull between, you know, innovation and the metrics are changing and the demand for innovation is increasing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it is really important for procurement to stay on top of what's happening and be able to then, you know, use that knowledge to provide better outcome for the organization. At the same time, you know, there's a risk component to working with smaller companies, especially startups, that don't check the boxes that you typically would check. And I think as a culture, it's really important to identify what innovation means and what are the bandwidths for risk, mm-hmm. and what are the consequences of risk, and be able to open, you know, or expend, I guess, the accepting that there's some things that may fail, but if you don't try, you're not going to be able to see this, you know, positive results. And there's many examples where someone who took a chance really impacted the top line as mm-hmm. well as the bottom line. So, And what I would say is, to take a chance. And I think, Greg, actually, you said it at the round table in San Francisco, is that we're talking a lot about disruption and innovation and, helping these companies that are doing things more innovatively, or how can we take procurement and move into the future. Well, if you're not giving a chance to the companies who are working, really hard to change the way things are being done, then you're just talking, right? So, the best way to encourage companies to help move the function forward is to enable them to come into your company, either maybe through a pilot, so it's less risky, building the use case to then, deploy the service or the product across the rest of the organization in a way that, reducing risk, meanwhile seeing the benefits and showing the benefits to the rest of the organization.
And Greg, I know you've been a supporter of small businesses at VSP, so how do you go about mitigating some of the risks? Because I think, from my experience, that's what organizations are typically concerned about when it comes to engaging smaller businesses, startups, both in procurement but outside of procurement. What are some of the things practically you can do to help an organization come to terms with that?
Interesting question, Phil. Actually, throughout my career, dating back to Oracle, Salesforce, et cetera, I've been very open to innovative companies bringing disruptive solutions, as Steph says, to the marketplace, and either through a pilot. Yep. So from a strategy standpoint, you can pilot a technology in a limited scope to get a feel for how they're progressing, or you can, vet the relationship using a company like Tealbook from a supplier intelligence standpoint to gain a broader view of their capability, their financial risk score, more about the company. And even if they're, pre-IPO, they're in a startup mode, there are ways to engage an innovator, a disruptive technology, and bring it into a company and explore. But the challenge that you have is information today is so disaggregated. Yeah. It's really hard to get a very holistic view of a company. You can rely on credit risk scores like Dun & Bradstreet, D&B, but if it's pre-IPO, it's self-reported. Yeah. So is the data really credible? There's sources out there. Again, it's just you have to be very diligent in doing your review search of a supplier to really appreciate, not only the technology, not only their offering, but are they going to be here tomorrow? So right. You can put their code in an escrow account to protect it. Personally, what I have found is with a lot of these companies is they are very disruptive. They're unencumbered by the bureaucracy of a larger company, and they're very quick to deliver a solution, especially if it's cloud-based.
One of the interesting things you noted there was about finance, and from a small business perspective, do you actually view them through the same lens? So, if it's a more established company, you anticipate that financial health and stability and all the things that come with that are obviously top or high up on the list in terms of considerations. For smaller businesses, there's kind of this acceptance that finances aren't going to be as good as what they could be because they're trying to get ahead of themselves and they're trying to invest in their solution. So do you look through a different lens at smaller companies than you would do for a larger company when you're assessing them?
Interesting. I still look at their operating cash flow to make sure that they're earning it faster than they're burning it.
Yeah.
Because it's an investment. You're making an investment in them. Granted, it's not financial, but you're setting up a relationship.
Yeah.
Your brand, your credibility as the head of procurement, head of sourcing, is tethered to that relationship. If you make an investment and they're burning it faster than they're earning it and they're not here tomorrow, you have to unravel that, right? And you lose credibility within the organization. So I do look at their operating cash flow. I do look at other financial ratios just to make sure that, they will be here tomorrow. So you have to align with the right players, but you can take a calculated risk based on how disruptive, innovative they are in the space. I look back over my career. I was an early adopter of Coupa.
Yeah.
I think they were Series A, maybe Series B funded. But part of making that assessment is really understanding the risk that you're willing to accept. Steph talked about risk tolerance.
Yeah.
It's really understanding your tolerance for risk and making sure that you have a very deep, robust perspective on the supplier. Mm-hmm. So I'm bringing it back to tealbook. Having supplier intelligence is really critical.
And that kind of segues, I think, nicely into the roundtables. So the roundtables were to actually explore findings from a recent Hackett Group study, looking at how procurement professionals actually spend their time. What do they do across the procurement kind of continuum, if you will, with a part of the study dedicated to supplier intelligence and how do you find supplier data? The information, how do we find out information about our current suppliers, the incumbents, and how do we find out information about new suppliers? I think, Steph, you're probably best placed to answer this. I'm interested to know what were some of the key findings of that study that formed the basis of that roundtable.
From our perspective in working with the Hackett Group, we were looking at a way to measure the time spent on looking, searching, gathering supplier data to help the business make decision on which suppliers should be moving in the process. It was incumbent, so looking for information internally or externally to support your incumbent supplier's decision or look for new suppliers.
Yeah.
And then what was the sort of impact of that in terms of loss of time or money or opportunities? And the two sets of data that we've used, to essentially support the discussions for the roundtables were, using current methodology and what we've been doing for some time, how does that relate to the future in terms of keeping up with the business needs to stay agile and the demands for strategic sourcing to be more strategic? And so the data that we looked at is, one, if it takes time to look for supplier information, you've lost an opportunity to influence because you have to leave to go and gather the data.
Yeah.
You've lost your opportunity to add credibility to the partnership and to create value. If there is a stakeholder who says, I know the one supplier that can do this, there's only one supplier, and you don't have the intelligence to be able to have an educated conversation around potential other option because you have to go and look for it, then that's where you really lost your opportunity to influence, to have add that credibility that you understand the space and the players, and also add value by providing different options for them to potentially consider. And then the other point that we talked about was really, if it takes too much time to go and look for intelligence, then how often do we revert back to incumbent suppliers, which are very important for most of our clients. They want to leverage their existing relationship, and there's many reasons to do that. At the same time, does that impact access to more innovative type of partners that could impact the business positively?
So when we look back and think about the roundtables, it's a question, I guess, for both of you, but Steph, I'll ask it to you first. What are some of the things that you heard the most from the folks that took part in those events?
I think, some of the CPOs came as almost a favor.
Right.
I asked nicely to attend, and they were very well attended. As you know, we had about between, I think, 13 and 18 people per table. And I think walking away realizing how much conversation this topic would generate. That we had 3 hours in San Francisco, I think it was even 4 hours of uninterrupted, no breaks, talking about that specific topic.
Yeah.
What are the benefits? What are the challenges of not having access to intelligence? And what would be the benefit of having access to good, trusted supply intelligence? And so that's, I think that was encouraging to see that the topic generates so much energy and excitement and debate, which was great, and we want a different perspective. The 2 points I think that came back the most that I wouldn't say surprised me, but it was around processes. I think everybody in every table agreed that processes were overkilled very, very often. It's the 7-step sourcing that we've been applying to procurement for some time, and that it needed to be quickly assess to see what level of process each interaction or each sourcing event did require, and was it really part of the process was in fact potentially a crutch for not having the intelligence. Mm-hmm. That if you had the intelligence and you were able to access it instantly in that conversation with your stakeholder, that there's a lot of the upfront processes that you could jump, right, and then you could move a lot faster and creating a lot more value for the business. And so that came back, I think, in most tables, debating the need for processes and rethinking that. The other thing I think that surprised me, and it was not part of the agenda at all, but each table talked about the process inflicted, and the word inflicted was used heavily on suppliers. Mm-hmm. And we had two tables who had suppliers, so which was really interesting to hear their perspective, but that the time and resources spent to be remembered, thought of, included in a potential RFP, and then going through an RFP or an auction, whatever process clients are using, was so expensive and time-consuming. And if there's a way to provide better intelligence, allowing suppliers to be essentially gain more perspective based on their existing customers and who they do good business for, and based on what specifically product and services that they're offering to their customers, and we could take this data and put them in front of similar customers with similar needs. What would be the benefit to them in simplifying this process? Yeah. And then really focusing on on opportunities that have better chance of generating into actual business. And if they were taking the time and resources, sort of reshifting that to spending more time on generating value to their customers, essentially bringing more innovation to their customers, then everybody would benefit. Mm. And so I thought that was really interesting. And even someone suggested we should do a roundtable with suppliers in the room right. to talk about this specific topic.
Right. And Greg, from your perspective, I know that you joined us for the San Francisco session. What are some of the main things that you recall and that were discussed in that perhaps things that may have surprised you as well?
Yeah, it was interesting. We had a internal customer in our discussion. Yeah. It was interesting to get his perspective on procurement, some of the challenges. Working with procurement, I do agree with Steph that fundamentally it comes down to speed of execution, having access to intelligence. Yeah. Listening to Steph, one way that you can accelerate the process is by sharing of information. Rather than me collecting it, mm-hmm. Phil, you collecting it, Steph, you collecting it, all pinging, exercising the supplier essentially for the same data set, W-9, certificate of insurance, supplier diversity status, material safety data sheet, whatever those requirements are, we collect it individually. If we can somehow, collect it one time, share it across the spectrum of, buying entities, it would accelerate the process. You append then the data with, credit risk score, other risk factor scoring, drawing, information off the web and aggregating that onto the supplier record, and it's going to accelerate the process. The challenge that procurement has today, for the most part, is the business has the luxury of, I don't want to say it this way, but the luxury of time mm-hmm. where they can invest and do their due diligence around an opportunity, right? And they make the investment. And if we don't engage early and they engage us at some point, we have to quickly pre-qualify suppliers, right? And maybe we're not as deep in the space as they are. We haven't had the luxury of time because we're scaling, we don't have the capacity, et cetera. There's a number of excuses that procurement offers up as to what our challenges are. But if we had better access to supplier intelligence, it would create parity, mm-hmm. equal footing on who's in the space, the pros and cons of that supplier, who's the best option, most valuable option, et cetera. So again, it creates parity. It gets back to your Machiavelli comment about information. The more information is shared with the masses, and the masses have an opportunity to opine, to comment, to create better intelligence, the quicker, the better the procurement organization will have in responding to the needs of the business.
even when I think of, and actually we had a great conversation. We had another roundtable a couple of weeks ago in Boston, and we talked about when does word of mouth does not become sustainable. They were all emerging companies, and so they exchange a lot of information in person. And then someone said at 100 employees, it starts really creating a lot of inefficiencies. And someone said at 200 employees. Meanwhile, last week I was having a conversation with the head of procurement of a very large company. They have 500 category managers globally. They moved to global shared services. And you ask them, how are they sharing supplier intelligence among themselves? And every time I ask that question, there's a smile. We don't do a very good job, or they don't. And, how, to me, and it's why I'm so passionate about this in 2017, why not? We have the technology. And so, the masses is great. And I think, the masses brings a lot of value. And of course, we're really focused on growth so that we do get, the mass data. But even at the company level, among 5 employees or 30 or 500, if you're able to ignite an opportunity for them to start sharing intelligence and in a way that will, accelerate their decision making and enable them to move a lot faster, there's a lot of value there.
Kind of a last question that I have on the sessions themselves. As you think about the differences between location, if I recall back to where we were New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, were the differences between some of the kind of perspectives and opinions from one location to another?
Well, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of energy. Some cities were maybe having a couple more glasses of wine, got more into the debate of choice. For example, and Philadelphia was very focused on having more choices versus controlling the data, visibility versus not giving visibility to your data, and people got really into the conversation and debated and provided different perspective. But I think everybody agreed that there's a need to rethink your intelligence strategy and focus on changing metrics. I think across all of the cities. What we had was really interesting in Chicago. We had someone that was doing a thesis on essentially peer collective intelligence being the new benchmark for trust. And so that really resonated. He called it social currency. So I got really excited about that topic. And we did talk about that topic and what it meant, artificial intelligence and supplier intelligence. And so that created a lot of, again, conversation. And I would say that San Francisco, just by the nature, it was all vertical. So we were not vertical specific. We did have life science. We did have consumers, retail, banking, insurance, and then in San Francisco was a lot of technology companies, and I think that was probably the biggest differentiator is how they were thinking about their metrics and what they needed to accomplish, and it was in a different context. And I would welcome Greg to maybe talk specifically about the San Francisco session.
It's interesting. San Francisco was principally high-tech companies, I would say, for the most part, relatively young. My company was probably the oldest. Well, actually, McKesson was in the crowd. So, McKesson and VSP were probably 2 of the more tenured companies, but certainly predominated by high tech. And we got into a conversation around, metrics, measures, how we define success. And, maybe 5 years ago, it was all about savings, hard savings, soft savings, where today it's about value creation. How do we create value for the company? And it takes numerous forms. It can be savings, yes, but I would submit to you it's less about savings. It's more about agility, speed to execution, meeting the needs of the business. And not only the business, but we also play this corporate social responsibility role where there's outreach to the local community from a supplier diversity standpoint. So, there's the inclusion aspect of how we procure goods and services, but its singular focus is on value, and value, again, takes numerous forms: risk mitigation, doing business with the right supplier, better contracts, greater accountability, supplier accountability, and yes, savings. So it was interesting to have the conversation with the people in the room when you start trying to baseline what are your performance measures, and you move away from savings into a conversation around value creation and how we're creating that value for our companies. So it was a healthy dialogue. It was refreshing.
And Phil, I would welcome your opinion on that, because you attended all four as well with me, and coming from your perspective.
No, I definitely, what Greg said then about different ways to measure performance, it definitely showed up in the San Francisco session. It's like, how can I save, I think one of the measures is, how can I save time for my stakeholders so they can focus on the things that they do best? And, how do I then measure the impact that has on the business? So it's just really interesting seeing all these different, kind of thinking outside the box to look at the ways that we actually produce value when value isn't, how do we squeeze every last dollar and cent out of our supply base? So that was definitely really interesting. When I think about the roundtables in totality, you mentioned a couple of things earlier that I definitely took away. One was the supplier point of view and the burden that we put on suppliers. How can we become a customer of choice by making it actually easier for a supplier to actually interact with us, because we already have a lot of information up front. Going through these sessions really opened my eyes, to how much the lack of visibility impacts our ability to be strategic. That's actually why I asked the question earlier about, do people actually recognize it's a problem? Because I think prior to the roundtables, it was something that I saw as, yes, I would like to have access to more supplier information and intelligence. After the roundtables, I realized that it just has such a big impact on how quickly and agile we can respond. How, if we don't have information, we spend an inordinate amount of time either calling people up, digging in emails, digging in files, reading stuff online, usually then going out and doing an RFI and giving a supplier 2 or 3 weeks in an RFI. And then we do an RFP, which has pages and pages so we can get as much information as we can. By the time we've done all that, the supplier has already, or the stakeholders already decided who they want to be a supplier. And that's why we end up just being transactional. They've figured out, I want this supplier because I know more than you do about them. Help me go through a transaction. And actually, if we had access to all that information up front, we could be very targeted on who we invite to, I don't even necessarily want to call it an RFP, but, to at least share their solutions with us so we could kind of co-define and co-develop them. How much more influence would we have on the selection process than just spending all of our time trying to get information? So that honestly was a big thing for me. And the fact that we don't know things about, I would say, innovators, small business, we don't know where to go, where to ask questions, we're kind of fearful of them, means that we continue to have a bias towards incumbents. And that's not necessarily because we want to work with the incumbents or we like the incumbents, but because we don't know any better and any different. And it's just the easiest, the quickest, let's just try and negotiate a few percentage points off and we're good, let's move on. And that, I think, does a disservice to our organization. So to me, those were really some of the key things that I took out of the sessions.
There's a couple of things, though, that you brought up. I know that it kind of came up, I can't remember which city, but we're talking about, if you don't come to the business with more intelligence and you need to go and get it, that's when you become the bottleneck. And coming to them with intelligence, then you actually are a valuable partner.
Right.
And then when in our conclusion and when we talked about key takeaways, it was all about reducing friction. And the word friction has now since then been coming back from everywhere. And so we're now defining sort of how does Tealbook reduces friction, and it reduces friction in the process and among stakeholders or users, because it provides a streamlined way to access information and collaborate. But you're the one in a conclusion that had brought that topic up, so I would love to hear more of your perspective on that.
Yeah, friction. I think that one of the things that we as a procurement organization should do, I'm not saying it's something we don't do, it's just something that we can challenge ourselves to make sure we do as much as we can, is we actually want to be involved as little as possible in a process. We want to come in and we want to be involved at the areas where we have the highest value, where we can actually bring some benefit to the stakeholder, bring some benefit to the business, and kind of get out of the way for the rest, because, we have this reputation of being involved in everything and slowing processes down, slowing business down. And so to my mind, we should actually try and get out of the way as much as we can, or look at ways that we can actually expedite the process so that we're not creating burden. So I just think about it as being, again, how can I give as much value by providing as little kind of interaction almost as possible so the business can do their job. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I think about friction and trying to get out of the way, essentially. Do what we can, get out of the way, let the business do what they need to do.
Bill, I completely agree. The procurement function, the sourcing function, we need to enable self-service tools for the business, across our space. Educate them, provide the tools, and support them more in a consultative advisory role than what we are today.
Yeah.
That's the only way, in my opinion, we're going to move us out of the transactional, more into the strategic, is by partnering with them on their level. So if they want frictionless, if they want data at their availability that's relevant, that's impactful, that's the solution that we should be providing. We don't need to be the gatekeeper for the information. Make it available to them.
Yeah. Last question. I think you've had time to reflect now on the sessions themselves. I'm interested in terms of takeaways. What did you take away from them? What actions can CPOs actually take and put in place based on some of the things that we found?
I think, in some of the key points that we had highlighted in our initial key takeaways, and we're developing some white papers around some of those topics. But I think it's really important for procurement leadership to look at their organization and how are they going to move forward in developing an intelligence strategy that will help them move into the future. A lot of CPOs have asked me recently, how do you track millennials into procurement? Well, give them tools that they're used to using for the last 15 years and don't give them a 2-week training to figure out how to find information. I think that's really critical. And how do you start using knowledge to accelerate and scale the function? And then I would say just to be open to those new technologies. Greg pointed out in the roundtable in San Francisco, and I think everybody, even in New York, we didn't talk about tealbook at all in context. We didn't present tealbook, although it did come up in conversation. And I think one of the key takeaways towards the end is how can we help you? Because, we want to see tealbook. How do we help you be successful? I'd say is any startup companies like us or any others, and there's amazing companies that are in the market now, to give them a chance. Mm-hmm. They need customers. They can't have that financial, the score that you're looking for and have this, reduce the risk unless they have customers. So it's really important for ones who have more bandwidth for risk to give them an opportunity and bring them into their organization and help them be successful. There's no technology that can be great unless we have actual users, and getting and learning from their feedback, and we're listening carefully to make sure that tealbook continuously provide value. And then I would say that knowledge is credibility, to have as a procurement professional, as we talked a lot during this podcast, if you come to the table with intelligence, you're going to gain a lot of credibility. They're going to come back to you, and then when you come back to you, and hopefully they come back to you more, and more people come to you for your support, then you're continuously able to help meet their goals and build that reputation, not just for you but for your team and for the function. And then to make sure that you're looking at your processes, and what was in the books even 5 years ago does not apply anymore. Technology has evolved so much that if you can skip some of those processes and move faster, I think you're going to benefit a lot from it. You'll be probably less frustrated and get a lot more reward professionally and personally. Mm-hmm. So I would say those are some of the key takeaways that I took from the roundtable.
There is one point that I'd like to add, and I think, Steph, you said it, or maybe Phil, you did earlier in the conversation. Supplier intelligence. Think about the supplier cost of entry to onboard into a new buying group, a new procurement organization. If we could somehow simplify that and remove that cost and create greater parity and remove that entry point, I think it would help a lot of these smaller companies get established and become known as credible suppliers of technology, goods, services, whatever it might be. So just to add that one point, in a solution like tealbook, because again, it enables the masses, is one way of removing that entry point.
I have one very last question. Hopefully this is the easy question. You mentioned before there was some initial takeaways, like a document that you put together. I know you're working on some white papers as well. Where could the listeners actually go to find out a little bit more about some of the findings from these roundtables?
Yeah, so we did initial key takeaway summary. So it's highlighting these 6 points, expanding a little bit on them. We're in the process of developing a larger summary and then really tying into a white paper. And we're going to do more initiatives. So definitely reach out. You can send me an email at slapierre@tealbook.com or even connect on LinkedIn. Then the initial key takeaways, you can get a copy through a website. Essentially, it's get.tealbook.com. I know, I'm sorry, it's not as simple as it would be /executive roundtables 2017.
Okay. Right.
So you can get a copy there and download.
I'll include the links to the documents that you referenced, also but to both of your LinkedIn profiles, and I'll put that in the show notes for today, and that's going to be at artofprocurement.com/tealbook roundtable. That's all one word. That's artofprocurement.com/tealbook roundtable. So Greg and Steph, just thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.